Thank you for joining us this evening or this afternoon. My name is Christopher Smart. I'm the head of the Barings Investment Institute, and we are delighted to host you here today with our friends and colleagues at the Official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum, which I have just said successfully for the first time without tripping on any of the syllables. We are also happy to bask in the auspicious powers of OMFIF, because when we launched this publication a week ago in Singapore, we had no idea that in spite of dramatically worse news on manufacturing data in the United States, in spite of inflation gapping down in the Eurozone, and in spite of oil tankers aflame in the Persian Gulf, the market would rally from there. And I attribute all of that to the launch of the Global Public Investor publication by OMFIF and Barings in Singapore last week. And therefore I had no worries at all this afternoon looking out my window that when we gathered here on our terrace that the auspicious powers of OMFIF would fail once again and the sun would shine through and bless us with warm thoughts of summer. We are delighted in particular at Barings to be a part of the 6th annual publication of the Global Public Investor. It is a treasure trove of market analysis, economic analysis, analysis of a variety of activities by official institutions, official investors from around the world. I commend it to you. In particular, we were delighted to contribute some of the first publications of the Barings Investment Institute. Our institute is a think tank that operates within Barings across our teams around the world and across the capital stack, as I like to say. We hope that we can continue to work with our friends at OMFIF as we roll out more research. What we try to do within Barings is to offer macroeconomic and political analysis to the bottom-up investment teams in real estate, in private equity, in fixed income, and in our equity strategies. We also try and create a marketplace of ideas across the firm, and then using those conversations, try to develop broader investment themes that we think will be useful to investors looking out over a 5 or 10-year horizon as they try to make some investment decisions. So for the next 25 minutes or so, I'm delighted to turn the podium over to my colleague Gary Smith, who will will give you some taste of our most recent white paper. All of our white papers, all of our materials are on the Barings website at barings.com. Then we will invite Professor Kerry Brown from King's College to offer his perspective on developments in China from his many years of travel and study and scholarship on Chinese affairs. And then OMFIF Chairman David Marsh will anchor the final leg of our proceedings here today with some final thoughts here. So let me turn it over to Gary. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. So the white paper that you all have a copy of, that you may be sitting on right now, is on urbanization. And talks about what China is doing in terms of its decision to build city clusters of cities. China's taking urbanization to a place that it's not been to before. And the numbers are astonishing. And whenever I talk about it to people in London, they tend to fall over when they see the numbers. So let's just run through some of them. The cities are all marked and the city clusters are in shade. And you can see that the primary three city clusters are in a darker shade. So this is the Beijing cluster, the Shanghai cluster, and the Hong Kong, Macau, Shenzhen cluster. So the population of the Beijing cluster will be about 130 million people. 130 million people. Even the Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Macau cluster, known as the Greater Bay Area, will be about 65 or 70 million, bigger than just about any European country. So what China is doing in terms of building these city clusters is pretty important, not just for China and perhaps for political stability in China, but it's also potentially a very important lead for what might happen elsewhere in the world where urbanization is still continuing to be an important part of the economic development process. Obviously the rest of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, and maybe one day Africa. Three things really are happening in China that make it possible to undertake this massive project. The rural to urban migration that I've talked about, and the fact that China is able to cut across administrative regions with its planning process and get things done. One of the key things it's getting done, of course, is a massive infrastructure build-out. That's particularly obvious when you look at the Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong, Macau, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and surrounding cities. So these are two maps of the Greater Bay Area, one 2010, one 2018. And what the lines show you is what the effect of the transport infrastructure build-out has been in terms of commuting times from Hong Kong Central. So in 2010, your 1 hour commuting possibility was basically the territories. Today, your 1 hour commuting possibility, thanks to the high-speed train and the build-out of the MTR, is somewhat more interesting. Cities are about labour markets, and that's particularly the case as we transition from manufacturing industry to service industries becomes increasingly important. Having labour mobility, being able to tap a wider labour market is the key to clipping those agglomeration benefits. And what China is doing is testing new limits for what agglomeration benefits might be in terms of urban development. So you can see in 2018, the 3 hour commuting time zone, which is perhaps a weekly commute, not a daily commute, but just about everybody who's in the GBA could, in theory, do a weekly commute to Hong Kong Central. Some of these commutes will work in the opposite direction as well, but I think that's a very neat way of showing what transport infrastructure developments have been able to achieve to date. It's not all good news. When I was in Hong Kong 6 weeks ago, I took the new 55-kilometre road, tunnel, bridge from Hong Kong to Macau. It's great fun. That's the view from the back of the bus. I went on the bus. That's the view from the back of the bus. There are no cars on the road that I could see, and very few buses. This bridge goes from Hong Kong to Macau and on to Zhuhai. It drips with symbolism. Obviously, it's a very political investment, and currently usage levels, I think, we can report as being quite low. And you know, the report that we've written delves into the Greater Bay Area story in particular. Of all the city clusters, as I mentioned, there are three big ones, three primary stories. We think that what happens in the Greater Bay Area will be the most important, not just economically, but obviously politically, because it includes the special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau. So, there you go. And I can tell you that the journey is even more interesting than appears in this picture, because you start by driving from Hong Kong on the left-hand side of the road. You cross to the right-hand side of the road when you're over the PRC's sea, or under it even, and you switch back to the left when you get to Macau. It's an extremely symbolic investment, and it perhaps illustrates that not all the investment that's taken place in terms of this infrastructure build-out has been subject to the rigours of the cost-benefit analysis that we would do in the UK. Not that the UK process is a good one. As we saw yesterday, we saw an announcement that Heathrow Airport will be ready in 2050. I think we can learn from each other. I think there are ways that we can learn from each other. And just to close things out in terms of this session, while I was when I came back from the road journey to Macau, I took the train journey from Hong Kong to Shenzhen. Now, this was different. Tickets were sold out on the day that I did the trip. It's extremely popular. What we have here is the return trip into Hong Kong. You are at immigration here, and the yellow line is the line you mustn't cross until the person in front has cleared immigration. And there's extra help here to tell you, please don't cross the yellow line. I did take a photo, but I was on the Hong Kong side when I took it, so I felt relatively reassured. It's a fascinating trip, but I tell you, if you don't like your photograph being taken, don't do this journey, because there are hundreds and hundreds of cameras as you pass through the passport control. So what we have is a really significant event in terms of the process of urbanization in the world. China is leading the way. Other countries could learn and could copy what China is doing, but in the report we ask, do they have the appetite and do they have the planning wherewithal to affect these changes? China is going to benefit enormously in terms of the productivity dividend that it's able to clip from this urbanization project. And the real question for us here is, will these gatherings of cities, will the city clusters magnify that effect? In terms of the investment story at the micro level, obviously there are big implications for firms that build infrastructure, trains, tunnels, etc. And obviously a very significant impact in terms of real estate investments, especially around these transport nodes. It's a fascinating story. That's why we decided we wanted to write about it. Please, if you have any feedback in terms of the report itself, which you'll all now have a copy of, we would be delighted to take the conversation to the next stage. I'll hold it there.
And so thanks for coming this evening, and thank you very much for inviting me. So we just heard China is a story of big statistics, and they're sometimes quite overwhelming. The idea, I think, that there's 260 cities in China, over 1 million people, is that right? So, you know, this is a bit overwhelming. So what I suppose my function tonight to do is to try and kind of tell a story that makes sense of that. Urban China is new. It has only really existed kind of really in the last 40 years. In 1978, at the beginning of the reforms under Deng Xiaoping and the leaders around him after the Maoist period, there were probably about 15% of people living in cities. And now it's over 50%. The last census in 2010 was 50% rural, 50% urban. I think the next one, which is next year, will probably show 65% urban, 35% rural. And to be honest, I think most people, probably more than that, because of migrant labourers and all of the other associated groups, live in places that look like cities, even if they're not classified as cities. So how do we make sense of this story? So I think there's like the 4 A's. First of all, asset. Secondly, aspiration. Thirdly, actor. And fourthly, angst. So, asset. The Chinese middle class, those that live in cities, this emerging group, are the world's greatest economic asset. They're the world's greatest economic asset because at the moment, in terms of their contribution to consumption in China, it's relatively low. I think it's about 1/3 of GDP, and that can only really increase. It's also true that they are more and more working in services. This is an enormously important group, not just for the domestic government, but also for the rest of the world. And I think this group is at the heart of the clash between the United States and China at the moment. It's an important group for us in Europe because these are kind of really the core creators of growth in what we call the new normal, the new model of the Chinese economy that Li Keqiang, the Premier, has been talking about in the last 6 or 7 years. So this is an important group. As an asset, it is absolutely core. The second A, aspiration. So the aspirations of this emerging urban-based middle class are really key, and they are not uncomplicated. This is not an easy group to kind of quantify. It is not an easy group, in terms of its socioeconomic composition to kind of label. But one thing is for sure, at the heart of the Xi Jinping leadership is the kind of promise, which is not economic. It's not an economic story. It is really about creating what's called the China Dream, fulfilling the aspiration for this group in particular of living in a country which is great, powerful, strong, that has its status restored to it after a modern history which has often been complex and tragic. And so that is really, I think, at the heart of the message of the Xi Jinping leadership. It is emotional. It is highly mobilizing because I think it transcends the boundaries of the party's normal message, and it certainly transcends the boundaries of just, as was true in the past, appealing to producing economic tangible goods. I mean, we are now in the period of a China which is idealistic. That can be very problematic because the last time that happened was in the period of Mao Zedong. So that didn't end super great. I think the idea is that this ends much, much better. The aspirations of this group, therefore, are absolutely key. And we can see them inscribed on the landscape of China in its kind of dynamism and energy. When you go there, you can feel these aspirations are visible, and they kind of really energize everyone that comes close to them. And they certainly reach into the outside world through things like the Belt and Road Initiative. That is my token kind of reference to the Belt and Road Initiative. Everyone has to reference it, so I've done it. Okay, we can do that one, get it out of the way, and now we can talk about normal things. Right, so thirdly, the other A is actors. So you would probably see a lot of coverage if you go to China. You certainly are aware of this sort of idea that China is basically run by one guy. It's all centralized. It's all about Xi Jinping, and he's everywhere. He's inscribed in propaganda. I mean, kind of the whole story seems to be about one guy. But I think that's not really where the core kind of driver of this story is. The actors in this story are this urban middle class, because of the aspirations that I've mentioned, but also because of the fact that they're the ones who are going to have to be kept happy. And if they are not mobilized by the party's nationalistic, aspirational message, they have no loyalty to the party's ideology. I mean, I don't think anyone has kind of any illusions about that. This group, therefore, are really the core sort of tellers of this story, and they're the core audience for this stories of kind of national renaissance as you see it written around and told around China. So that is, I mean, really key to remember that this group, with their complexity and their kind of deep, their sort of deep aspirations, this is the one that really is writing this story, not one individual sitting in Beijing at the head of the Communist Party. That is a mirage, I believe. I think that's a mirage. There are ways in which the leadership, the elite leadership, are important, of course. They create frameworks. They kind of create the idea of an ethos for the party to deliver and serve to this people. But they are the servants, right? And this group that we're trying to understand better and conceptualize better are the absolute key actors. Angst, finally. So there is a generic story about urbanization, not just urbanization with Chinese characteristics. Urbanization with Chinese characteristics is very rapid. And in terms of the scale, as we've just seen, that is unique, the scale and the speed. But it is urbanization. And generically, urbanization throughout the world has led to fundamental kind of changes in the inner lives of people who've gone through that process. And when we go to China, I think, on the one hand, we see a sort of material landscape, which I kind of think we probably conceptualize and understand okay. But there is this place called Deep China. And actually, that's an academic term, Deep China, which is the inner lives of Chinese people that the Communist Party and everyone else is trying to understand. That is a China that is going through the same colossal challenges that industrialization in the West led to. A China in which there are many, many issues about well-being, about trying to create a sort of sustainable, balanced life, which we know quite a lot about and are still grappling with, and which China is starting to grapple with. And so that place is kind of an extraordinary, sort of unknown territory. And I stress that that is unknown not just to observers looking at this kind of, deep China, but to the Chinese leadership. No one really knows what the ultimate aims and ambitions of this incredible group of emerging middle class are. They clearly are very hybrid. They are hybrid in their belief systems. There are now 200 million Buddhists in China. There are 100 million Christians. There are maybe 40 million Muslims. There are many followers of folk religion. This is a group that is also very international. 140 million Chinese journeys abroad last year. Granted, quite a few in the region and maybe duplicate kind of, or one person travelling several times. That's still a huge number of people. From 1949 to 1976, there were 750,000 people movements in and out of China, right? And now, in 1 year, there's, over, 200 times that. So this is a very international group. The final thing I'll say is to sort of recognise the work that you're doing here. One thing is for certain. Whoever works out how this group ticks, and whoever kind of comes up with a way of sort of really working with this group is in a great position. I guess Apple kind of were, they kind of sold so many of their phones to this group, but now it's dwindling. Anyone who manages to conquer not just the pockets, but the hearts of this people, this sort of group, is, kind of really looking at the golden goose, as it were. This is the sort of extraordinary group. It's a real cliche. Napoleon said, when China stands up, it'll shake the world. I don't know. Apparently he said that. So I don't think that's right. My kind of, 200 years from him saying that, I'd say when Chinese middle class start spending, they're going to shake the world. They're already starting to shake it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I really do think that we are trying to get into the minds of the Chinese here. So this does sound like an enormously ambitious idea that you've set us for the next issue of Global Public Investor, Kerry, to penetrate deep China. And obviously we've all heard about the deep state. And I wonder whether there is any way that we from the West can indeed get anywhere near the depth of China. I think you've given us a few ideas on how to do this. Just in my few minutes, I simply like to talk about this interconnection between light and shade in China. Glad you used the word angst, because there do seem to be some relatively strong resemblances with Germany here. One of the findings of the Global Public Investor this year was how Germany has now become comprehensively the #2 net creditor in the world, taking over from the Chinese position that they've had. The Chinese have had much smaller current account surplus in recent years, so that means they own less of other people's paper. And of course, being a creditor is not actually a very comfortable position, because people are likely to devalue their way out of trouble. The fact that many people overstate German strength, I think they do also with China. China is clearly very strong, but it's still a developing country. It is brittle, it is vulnerable. Otherwise there wouldn't be all those plainclothes men knotting around in Tiananmen Square, even when there's not an anniversary. And also the fact that freedom of speech is clearly not all that high up on the list of the party's agenda. We just heard about our friend George Magnus, who wasn't allowed to speak at a conference, apparently, because he's brought out a relatively critical book. George is a critical person. I'm sure you all know about his book. This is a sign, I think, of some brittleness here behind this facade of great strength. If we, from the West, can try to understand a bit more about that sense of vulnerability, which somehow coincides with the enormous strength of China, if we can understand their very legitimate fears about being undermined by the West, whether through the imperialists of the United States or through the Europeans in some way, if we can understand also how they do need some technology transfer from we in Europe as well to overcome what you call the 150 years of being somewhat retrograde, then I think we're going somewhere towards that. I don't think, particularly myself, as a person who doesn't understand the Chinese language, I don't know whether we can get anywhere near that. All we can do, I think, is to try to work with our Chinese friends to understand something more of this pattern of light and shade that permeates China. I mean, these great statistics that you showed us, Gary, that will clearly cause a great deal of perturbation and also mental hardship as people adjust to the strain of living in one of these bright new cities with these 130 million people in the conurbation. This question about sustainability, which is a great question, a great task for the Chinese leadership to overcome. How do you actually get sustainable cities? How do you get people living in these urban spaces to feel comfortable? How do you feel that they can become comfortable with, say, real estate prices? We seem to be going up everywhere, but they're not getting the concomitant increases in living standards to pay for the real estate. Could cause enormous strains. It could cause a similar kind of economic and political perturbation of the sort we saw during the Cultural Revolution. So I think we have to end any conversation about China with more questions than answers. I'm very pleased that in this publication, which now, as you say, has come out for the 6th time, Christopher, thank you again for all your help. Colleagues at Barings, colleagues also at State Street Global Advisors who are in the audience as well, always been a great accompaniment for us. DZ Bank, the German bank, with whom we've had a few summer parties in the past. It nearly always rains right up until the moment of the summer party, and then the sun comes out, as you said. They've all contributed in lots and lots of different ways, as have very many contributors from all over the world to what has been a great team effort. I'd like to think that next year, when we come back again, no doubt in an even sunnier evening at Barings, we will somehow get inside the mind of deep China. Let that be our ambition. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along. There may well be questions, there's bound to be questions. I would say that maybe we should have the questions over a few drinks rather than in a theatre-style conversation. I'd like to thank everybody very much for coming and join us in trying to penetrate deep China. Thank you very much indeed.